All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Phil Wegstrom. I'm with the Office of CTO here at Vast Data, and we're going to talk today about views and view policies. So let me get started here. We'll start by boring you a little bit with slideware, and then get into a bit of a demo as to how we handle our views and how we create uh, exports of our data out. So let me share my screen out here for all of us to look at. Oh, there you go, right there. All right. So with that, let's get started. Now, when it comes to, we're going to be talking about views, view policies, and multi-protocol. So let's kind of define what we're looking at here. So, views and view policies basically, talks about how do we present data to users and the rules governing those governing permissions and access control. So if you think of it, a view is really a generic term. We use the term within VAST of a view rather than an NFS export or an SMB share or an S3 bucket. For that, view is the generic term that covers all of those. And a view basically is what data are you sharing out, and by what method or what protocols are you sharing that data out? A view policy is controls kind of the how you're sharing or controlling how you're governing access. So, the view policy will control things like what permissioning methods you are using for that, how you want the personality of the view to behave. So there are two different things. We'll go through each one of those with a demo. First, we'll start out with a simple view using a single protocol, and then we'll add additional protocols and talk about those as we go forward here. So again, as we mentioned, there is a live lab access for this here. So I'm going to steal a little bit of Jonas's thunder there a little bit because this was in the slides here. But if you go to vastdata.thecosmoslabs.com, you can go through and you can register with your email, get a code that you can use to sign in and log into a view-only representation of the VAST VMS and poke around and follow along. We have credentials that you can use. You'll be provided those as part of the lab guides there. But you'd log in as the user Cosmos with a password of Cosmos 2025. And then log in there. Yeah, and at the bottom is the link for effectively what the lab is within the environment. I'm not going to go through using. I'm not going to demo using that environment because that environment is a read-only environment. I'm going to be using some of our internal lab systems when we get to the actual demo portion of things. So let's dive in. So again, we're going to talk about views. We're going to talk about view policies. We're going to go through how you create a new view and a little bit about how you create a new view policy. And then we're going to go a little bit more in depth towards the end and talk about what security flavors are and how multi-protocol comes into play, because VAST is a multi-protocol platform where we can upload our data via any protocol, via NFS, SMB, S3, and access it over any other protocol that we support without having to do things like move data around. That's the big advantage, one of the big advantages of our platform. So let's get started with views. So again, a view is something that is used to expose a portion of the element store, or expose a portion of the storage to the clients. There's a couple things that a view does. Number one, it defines where within the element store this data is located. And we use a hierarchical traditional file system method of representing where that data is stored. Now, the element store itself isn't a traditional file system for that. It behaves much different. It's much more rich and complex than your traditional file systems. But for ease of use, we're exposing views and things like that. We use a file system or in a directory-like structure to expose those. So along with that as well, we will define within a view the protocols that are going to be used. So we can share things out over NFS-v3, over NFS-v4, over SMB. For Windows clients, we could share this out as an S3 bucket for that. There's other types of views out there, like a database view that could be used, and eventually coming up with a new version of 5.3, which is going to be released here very shortly, we're going to be able to do block storage as well. So when we go through and we create a new view for this, we get asked a few questions. We get asked, what is the tenant this view is going to be from? What is the path that this view is going to be put into? And then depending upon what questions or what protocols we want to support, we may have other things that'll pop up. Like, what is, if it's an SMB, I need to provide an SMB share name. If I want to do S3 with this, I'll be asked what the S3 bucket name is going to be. And then we'll have, along with that, a policy name. And we haven't talked about the view policies yet, but we get to select which view policy we wish to use. And there's other things in there like a quality of service and things like that. For net new views, we're going to go through and create a new directory. A view, another way of looking at a view and why we'd have to create a directory is a view is really like you were exporting a file system. We can remove a view and that doesn't delete any data underneath it. And we can export it out again if we choose to do so. We can also do things like have nested views with different rules depending upon where you're doing them out. So again, I did kind of go already iterate through all of these here to describe on which one of these are. So I'm not going to you're not going to repeat this slide here. We can also go through, and there's certain things for different protocols, as I mentioned, that are relevant. So for things like SMB, we would define in here our S3 AC, I'm sorry, our SMB ACLs, our share level ACLs, which will govern, what the some of the controls on accessing on accessing the views for SMB specifically, or in the case of S3, we have some other features that we can go through and turn on specifically related to S3, such as maybe we want to do S3 versioning, or we want to make use of S3 object locks or things there. But these again are going to be, we're going to be able to go through and select these as part of the view, depending upon the protocols that we wish to export things using that. A view policy is something that is going to be used by one or more views. And basically a view policy goes through and we use what's referred to as a security flavor to describe the personality related features of the view. So if I want to have a view that is traditional NFS, meaning we want to just have permission controls be owner, group, everyone, or owner, group, other, read, write, execute, for each one of those, we can go through and do that. We set the security flavor to be NFS. If I want to have more granular permissions, such as I want to have inheritance rules and rich ACLs and things like that for SMB, I would select an SMB flavor. If I want to make use of identity policies and user policies and group these various different identity policies and bucket policies and things like that, I can go through and use the S3 native security flavor to go through and do that. Ultimately, with these different flavors, they just again describe the personality of that. They do control a little bit, they have some effect on the protocols, but really it's around where we want to set our permissions. And I'll talk about that a little bit more once we get into some of the multi-protocol stuff. It also goes through and we would set other things on there, such as access control rules, meaning which clients do I want to have access, which VIP pools do I want to have data presented out, or views that are using this policy presented out on, and other things such as auditing. So if I want to audit a whole bunch of shares together or a whole bunch of views together, I would set that in the view policy, and then all those views would use those same things. So we get a couple things. So if you think about it, is that a view policy is going to cover more than one view, one or more views. So with a view policy, we've got a couple different things here that we talk about. We talk about what tenant is it part of, because we can have different view policies for different tenants, or multiple view policies for the same tenant. We give it a name. Again, we define our security flavor, and we'll talk more in detail with those in a bit. And we control how we want to have things exported. Normally, if I leave things blank, we're going to present data out across all of the VIP pools that are configured on the system or configured within the cluster. But if I want to control where I want data presented out, I could select one VIP pool or multiple VIP pools individually. Maybe I've got a segmented network where I only want to have some views on an internal network and other views on an external network, or different network topologies. We can control things like that. But if I leave things blank for the virtual IP pools here, it's going to present it out across everything. And then we have our host-based access rules. So if you're familiar with NFS, NFS has the rules surrounding which clients are read-only, which clients are allowed read-only access, which clients are allowed read-write access. How do we handle the root user through squash rules? Do I want to treat the root user or UID0 as UID0 and allow them full rights to change and reset permissions, or do I not want to allow those? And then we also have the same thing for just a very coarse based on client source IP address. controlling read-write access over SMB or over S3. The last two here for SMB and S3, not a very common thing to do, but there are reasons to go through and do that if you feel so. We can also go through, I mentioned this here, we can also go through and do some things in the view policy to control some other features. Specifically, how do we handle group membership? So if you're familiar with NFS, there's a 16 group limit with the NFS RPC call. This is defined by the NFS RFC, saying you only have the owner of the file, or the user making the IO, their primary group, and then up to 16 groups. We can control that here to say where we're getting that information from. Do we want to rely on what's in the RPC, or do we want to leverage things like our Active Directory providers or Open LDAP providers to get all those additional groups? And then there's other options here controlling things like security. Do we want to enforce encryption over TLS? Do I want to enforce Kerberos encryption? We can do things like that through the view policy. And then we can do some other things. So things like if we want to handle, how do we want to handle the default POSIX mode bits for protocols that don't use POSIX mode bits? So this would be a situation like if we're talking SMB, when you create a file, it goes through it and wants to inherit permissions from the parent directory via inheritable ACLs. Well, if you're using an NFS flavor, which is your traditional Unix, that there aren't any inheritable ACLs. So this basically says for those types of operations, be it for SMB or S3, that we can set permissions a certain way for those protocols that otherwise wouldn't have permissions initially set on them. Then we have other controls in here as to how we control things like, characters. Do we want to allow certain character sequences for things like S3 that might be invalid on other protocols and some other S3 related settings? We can set up the default auditing for this. There is auditing that can be set up on the platform itself for a cluster-wide default auditing, but we can add additional auditing on certain files or certain views if we want to, surrounding all of those. So including the operations to audit, the protocols we want to audit, we would set those in the view policy. And then some other things in here, specifically around how do we handle different character sets, because NFS and SMB have different characters that are allowed and not allowed, and S3 has different characters that are allowed. So we can go through and say, do I want to enforce a limit to those characters and those path links, things like that, so that we are going to guarantee that all the data that I write over one protocol is going to be accessible and referenceable over other ones, or do I want to allow certain files or certain directories to be written or created that may have names that don't make sense in another protocol. So we can set some controls around those. So really, if I want to go through and I want to create a new view or create a new view policy, it's relatively simple. We go through and in the VMS GUI, you'll navigate to the element store. You'll go down, you'll click on the element store here, you'll click on views, and then this button says create new. And you just go through and populate the data that you want and say create, and a system goes out and creates those there, and it's immediately available for mounting on a client or immediately available over SMB or S3 or however you wish to go through and do it. Very, very simple, very easy to go through and do. So with that, I'm going to go through and just kind of walk through a quick demo of this, quick creation of some views and some view policies here. I'm going to run through one very quickly with an NFS view, and then I'm going to walk through one with an SMB view and show you how those are established, how those show up. And then we'll move on to some of the multi-protocol features for this. If you wish, there is a link here that talks about the lab guides for this. So if you want to look at this and kind of follow along with some of the procedures this would be the lab guide that you'd use in the Cosmos labs for read-only. It's not necessarily what you're doing here, but you'll get a general idea for it. So with that, let me go through and bring up my environment here. So I have already logged into my system. So I'm logged into my VAST cluster. I've got a whole bunch of views already existing here, but let's talk about the ones that I have. So I've created some view policies already for this. So I'm going to come in here. We see we've got a bunch of different view policies in here, but my view policies that I have are prefixed with demo. We're going to start with the NFS view policy. So I'm going to take a look at this, and we're going to see where this is, how this is put together. So I have a name here of demo NFS. It is the default view policy for this, for the default tenant. We're using the security flavor of NFS. I have my permissions basically open for any client to read or write. I am using the providers to get my NFS or to get my groups for my users. So with this setup here, I would be able to go through and handle more than 16 groups for any particular user. I don't have anything set up for S3 here, nothing specific for S3. This is, at this point, this is really only a NFS view, so I'm not doing anything really interesting with the SMB aspect. I do have my POSIX mode bits set here for this. So any file that I would create over SMB onto the views using this view policy would start out with these permissions. Any directories would have these permissions here. I'm not doing anything interesting with the auditing. This cluster doesn't have auditing turned on for it, so I can't even turn anything on here. And I've got files created using the lowest common denominator for this for just maximum compatibility with all of those. Okay. My other view policy here is an SMB view for this. This one is really going to be very similar. It's a very simple view. I'm using SMB flavor, meaning we're going to be expecting NTFS or SMB style permissions on things. It's exposed out over all the VIP pools, and I have all the kind of the same, very similar rules here for this, for these here. Now, the one thing you notice here is that the default POSIX mode bits, which was an option under SMB, does not exist in this flavor right now, or in this view policy, because I'm using the SMB flavor, and the SMB flavor has all those inheritable ACLs. So we don't need to define what the default POSIX mode bits will be, because it's going to get files created will inherit things from the parent directory. And then auditing advanced is all the same. So let's walk through. I've got the view policies created. Let's walk through and create a view. So first off, let's start. We're going to take a look at our views, the existing views that I have here. There's a whole bunch of different ones with different policies in use and different protocols in use, but we're going to create just a basic one. I'm going to start while using the demo one here. And I got a whole bunch of people that have demo using that. So, but let's create one net new ones here. So we'll come here, element store, views, and we say create new. And it's going to prompt me for the questions. I ask, what tenant are we creating this in? If we're not using multi-tenancy, default is going to be the tenant that's on there. This cluster does have multiple tenants on it, but we're not using, I'm just going to put this in the default tenant. We're going to go through, define the path that I'm going to use to create this view in here. This is going to have to begin with a slash. So we'll do slash, and I'm going to call this demo-NFS. And then I simply go through and select the protocols that I wish to go through and use. So in this case here, I'm just going to do this export as NFS v3 for this example. I don't have to provide an SMB share name. If I wanted to, I could go through and alias this out, meaning I could present this NFS view as something other than slash demo NFS, but I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to leave that the way it is. And then I select the view policy that I want. So I've got a whole bunch of view policies listed in here. I'm going to find that I want, which happens to start with demo, and I'm going to grab this demo NFS one. We're not going to set a quality of service policy for this, and we're going to create a new view. Now, before I do this, let's look at a client here, and I'm going to go through and take a look at my client. Hold on a sec here. Of course, that's going to be fun because it's not going to want to show me that. We'll do that. All right, so we're taking a look at my client here, and I'm going to just take a look at my exports off the cluster. So I'm going to do a show mount minus E against the VIP pool that I want to mount here. Main.se lab var 201. And just to filter some things out, I'm going to grep for demo, just to go through and show that grep demo. And we're going to see, again, there's a whole bunch of ones in here, but I don't have one that is being shown that is the NFS-demo one. I've got a whole bunch of other ones, but not the one that I'm looking for. Okay, so we don't have that view there. Now, if I go through and I save this, and I say I'm going to create a new directory, I'm going to create this view here. And we're going to be able to go through and run that same show mount command again. And I'm going to see in here that somewhere in the list, I have my demo NFS. And at this point, I can go through and I can mount it. So I have the mount already in here for this. So I'm going to go through and mount this here by my sudo password. And I have this mounted, I have available storage to it, and I can go through and I can start creating files. Do hello world here. And we'll see I'm able to go through and create files, just kind of how I would expect to do it. I'm going to put some data in here as well. Okay, so I have a file out there, I have data out there. Pretty basic, but very simple to go through, create new views. The default permissions on anything we present out is basically to be open. We would expect you to come in as root over NFS and do your chmods and your chones to go through and change the initial permissions if you wanted to tighten down those initial permissions. Okay, so let's do the same thing with SMB. So I'm going to create a view called demo-SMB, and I'm on Windows Explorer here. I see this. There is no demo SMB view that's out there. There's a demo 44 one, but not a demo SMB one. So let's walk through how we create an SMB view. And it's basically going to be the same thing, except we change a few things. We go demo SMB is the name of the directory. Okay, I don't want NFS view 3. I want this to be SMB. And then I get some other attributes that show up here. So here I'm going to go through and say I'm going to call this shared demo-SMB. And I'm going to use my demo SMB view policy that I created. I'm going to create a new directory. Now, there's a couple other options I could set, like share level ACLs if I wanted to. By default, we're just going to do pass-through for things. If I want to do things like access-based enumeration of the directory, I could do that as well. But we're going to leave this just the way it is. I'm just going to go through and do create, and the view gets created there. If I come back to my Windows client, I'm going to be able to go through here, and I'm going to see that I now have a demo SMB directory. So I can go through and I can mount this. I can access it. I can come in here and I can create a text document in here. Say hello SMB. And I'm going to put some data in it too. And we're going to save that out. And everything's good there. Now, the permissions that we set on this, again, are going to be very, very open. But if I look at permissions from a Windows side, we're going to see here that it looks like that. We can go through and do things like set permissions and things there. And there's some options here for this. We got one for everyone and creator, owner, creator group, which basically means whatever user creates the files or their primary group. That's how the files get set. And then we got some other ones here. These two kind of raw looking ones have to do with the root user and the root group on there. We could delete those if we wanted to for that, but they show up on there. But it behaves basically like a Windows view for them. So that's all fine. So very easy to go through, create views, create new policies, especially for a single protocol that's out there. So let's continue on here and go into a little bit more complex options here. Okay. So let's talk about a little bit more about those security flavors. What are those security flavors, and how does that apply to things like multi-protocol? How does VAST do multi-protocol, and really, what are the ins and outs of those different security flavors? So first off, let's go through and let's define what multi-protocol is. Are we talking just about I'm running multiple protocols on the same storage array? I've got files, I've got blocks, I've got objects on that. And no, we want to do more than that. Do I want to be able to access files over only file protocols and objects only over object protocols? Meaning S3 is off by itself? Not really. We're talking about being able to upload files or objects over any protocol and accessing them over any other one. So I want to be able to upload something over S3 or write a file over NFS and then read it over S3 or write it over SMB and read it over NFS. All of those there. This is what we're referring to when it comes to multi-protocol. Within VAST, this slide kind of describes how we do things. With this, we've got our protocol layers. And the protocol layers, each one of the protocols is something that we author in-house. VAST maintains all of those in-house. Each one of the protocols is considered equally performant. There is no inherent, from a performance perspective, of one protocol being faster than the other. Now, there's specific protocol limitations, based on just the protocol itself, but nothing within VAST that says, hey, NFS is always going to be 2 times faster than something else. For that, they're all equally performant. We're not using gateways, things like that. And under the covers, within the element store, all of the protocols, all of the permissions management, all the things there are all stored in a protocol independent fashion, which allows us to go through and give the same access to data, or the same access to data for a user, regardless of the protocol that they're using. So we have to go through and we have to talk about a few things with that. First off is user identities. We have to be able to get user identities from different providers for this. So we support Active Directory and LDAP to establish those identities for different users for that. And we can stitch those together in various different ways to go through and represent a user, so we know their Unix UID number, we know what their S3 access keys are, we know what their Windows SIDs are, and all their group memberships together to facilitate them accessing the same data from any protocol on the system. So that can be a little bit complex. We've talked about that with other webinars, so I'm not going to go through that here. But this is what we go through and do. We do abstract these a little bit internally, where we talk about, we store things as a VAST ID for this, and we'll go through as we encounter new users. We'll do all the lookups for the users as we encounter them and establish these VAST IDs. And a user will have multiple VAST IDs in order to establish their identity for these here. And this is kind of an example, an internal example, a little bit as to how we represent some of those. Not something you're going to be touching really all the time or really at all as an administrator. You don't have to deal with these, but it kind of gives an example. And the permissions that we have here are basically a superset of all the permissions that we have within the system for all the different protocols. And we use these security flavors to control those. So, the common question that we have when we start talking about multi-protocol is, how do you handle the different permission lines? NFS v3 really has no notion of what an SMB style ACL is. Windows doesn't know what a POSIX mode bit is. Windows creates files differently than what NFS does. NFS doesn't necessarily know what an S3 identity policy is for that. Or the common one is, well, if I do a chmod over NFS, what does that do to my SMB ACLs? So the security flavors within VAST are used to determine the permission checking algorithm, permission model that is used for that. So again, are we using just mode bits? Are we using identity policies? Are we doing SMB ACLs for access? It also goes through and determines which protocols are able to set permissions. So if I want to use just an NFS model, I may want to just limit NFS to go through and be able to set permissions. SMB will still be able to read files, will still be able to read files over Windows, but ultimately you can't change the permissions from SMB because SMB doesn't understand POSIX mode bits, or vice versa. Maybe I want to control my permissions from SMB. But I still want access over NFS. We can still read and write. It's just, where do we want to control the permissions from? And that's what we use with the security flavors. So I'm just going to iterate through these, very briefly with what all these entail. So we have 4 main security flavors for this. The first one is NFS. Again, this is going to be your traditional NFS or your Unix permissions for it. So owner, group, other, read, write, execute for each one of those. We do have the option of supporting POSIX draft ACLs. These POSIX draft ACLs are something that we're added on to NFS v3 to add some additional flexibility, give us some ACLs in there. Not really common across the industry. That's why it was never really fully ratified into an RFC, but we do support those if you wish to do that. We can go through and do with this flavor. We're able to do NFS v3, NFS v4 1 access, SMB access, S3 access. But with this, ultimately your permissions and the granularity you're going to have is going to be limited to those three three things. Are you the owner of the file? Are you the group owner, part of a group that is the group owner of the file? Or are you everyone? And then are you granted read, execute, read access, write access, or execute access on that particular file or directory. When we go through and we only allow for changing permissions over NFS with this flavor, again, you can still access data through the other ones. But if I try to do something that changes permissions from, let's say, SMB, or I try to go through and I try to do something from S3, I'm either going to get an explicit error saying you're not allowed to change permissions, or it'll just silently fail. Depends on the protocol you're using. Some of them behave differently if they get an error versus you just say, yeah, okay, you attempted and it didn't succeed, or looks like it succeeded and went from there. So the next one is SMB. SMB is going to be more of your NTFS style. So again, you'll have your full inheritance rules for that. You'll be able to create files over NFS or over SMB or over S3 for those. You'll be able to access those there. The file creation will be a little bit different if you're doing things over NFS, because the permissions that are going to be set on the file when you create it are going to be governed by what is inherited from the parent directory. When you're looking at things there, then your permissions may look a little strange in the sense that NFS, especially NFS v3, doesn't have the ability to interpret inheritable ACLs the same way that SMB represents them. So you may be looking at a file, it may look like you have no permissions for the mode bits, but you'll be able to read and write to that file because there's some ACL that's allowing you access. If you have programs that want to check the mode bits to see whether they have access before they attempt writes, we do have some settings to go through and change how those are represented, change how those are presented to allow for that. But generally we don't have to worry about that too much. We can do an SMB protocol, we can do NFSv3, we can do S3 with this as well. And if I do things and I want to, let's say, do some permission changes from, let's say, NFS, if I attempt to do permission changes from NFS, these permission changes are going to silently fail. We're not going to get an explicit error with the SMB flavor. And the reason for this is if you ever look at how if you ever look at a packet trace from SMB or NFS when file gets created, usually with NFS there's a file create action that happens and there's a permission setting action that happens, or permission setting call that does that. And if we errored on the permission setting call, that would break everything on there for break most scripts that are out there. So we just silently fail that for NFS. Another one here is mix last wins. Mix last wins is kind of a catch-all. Mix last wins allows for you to set permissions on anything. So you can set permissions from NFS, you can set permissions from SMB, you can set permissions from S3. Unfortunately, when you start having the ability to set permissions from any one of those or any one of those protocols, you have to be cognizant of what those changes are going to do, because it's very easy to go through and run a chmod, and the chmod command will go through and change all the permissions that are on there, or you'll remove an ACL, and that will affect a whole bunch of other things where the action you're doing might be valid on one protocol but not the other. So mixed last wins gives you a lot of flexibility, but with that there are some controls that you need to establish around those. The last one really is kind of the most interesting one when you think about it in terms of permissioning, and that's the S3 native flavor. So if you think about permissioning for NFS or for SMB, for that, you have to go through and do things like a chmod, or with Windows, you have to go through and add an additional ACE if you want to add access to a new group for that, and that may take some time to go through, because whenever you change permissions on a parent directory, you may want to go through, you have to populate all that down to the child directories there. So with S3, we can make use of identity policies. So these would be the same types of identity policies that you use for things like AWS for S3, and we actually use the same JSON syntax as AWS does for that, to support the same set of commands. And this not only will apply to S3 actions, like I'll have certain actions that I can do on an S3 bucket, but they will also apply to actions through other protocols, including coming in for NFS v3 or NFS v4.1 or SMB. such that if I want to allow somebody to have access to some data that is in an S3 native flavor view, rather than having to go through and run the equivalent of Chmod or adding ACLs, I just need to go through and attach the identity policy or create an identity policy that defines what that user or that group is allowed to do, and attach that identity policy directly to that user or to that group. And they will be granted those not only across S3, but across any one of the other protocols that are out there. There's also some other things here regarding S3 that are a little bit different. S3 really, if you look at it, it's a bucket style one with an object where the object name is the entirety, and it really doesn't have directory structures or things like that. But with this here, with other protocols, if the object has slashes in it, we will make that appear like there are directories over NFS or over SMB for those types of accesses there for that. So those are what some of the other protocols are, or so what the flavors are for those, or the options are within the view policies. Now, when it comes down to when you're creating your views, or you're creating your view policies, it comes down really, people ask, well, what flavor do I want to choose? If I'm talking about going forward in the future, what flavor do I want to choose? Do I need to make a bunch of considerations for multi-protocol from the get-go? That sounds really, really complex. And it's not. Really, when you start out, or in most cases when you start out selecting, look at how you're going to be accessing your data. Which protocols are primarily doing the writing of the data, which protocols are doing the reading of the data, and where do you as an administrator want to manage permissions, and which model makes sense. If SMB and you want to manage your permissions from SMB for this, SMB flavor is what you want. If the simplicity of your traditional Unix mode bits is fine, then NFS might be the one that you want. But in the cases of, if you're not sure whether you're going to be putting multi-protocol in, or you just want to do a single view, select the flavor that matches the protocols that you wish to go through and use to go through and do the initial set, and then you can add additional protocols. So you just need to, kind of look at that. Most of the time, it's very simple. Say, I want to have my permissions controlled by this model, and that's what I'm going to go through and use that to determine your flavor. So for data that's already out there, how do we make a view into a multi-protocol view? And this is very, very simple to go through and do, and it doesn't change any of the data that you have out there, which is really a cool thing to be able to do. All that you have to do to add an additional protocol is go through, find your view in the element store, and add the additional protocol. Click on the additional protocol you want to share it out. And if it is something like I need to go through and add SMB to it, I would need to add an SMB share name to it. That's it. And then click update, and you're done. Doesn't change any of the existing data that's out there. It's immediately available. Same thing if I wanted to remove it. I can just go through and remove it. So how does this look? I mean, how does this go through and look here? Well, let's go back to my views here. So I have my views here. I have my two views. So we'll start out with my demo NFS view here. Okay, so I have my demo NFS view that I created using S3 or using NFS. Okay, if we go back, remember I have a single file here for this. I have a file called Hello World. From here, I'll touch another file here. Touch a file here saying it's come from NFS, just so we know we're talking about the same file or the same view. So I have those two files out there. Now, this one here is only exposed over NFS v3. Well, let's go through. We're going to edit this, and we're going to bring this up. I want to add this out to be visible over SMB. So I come into my protocols, I click on SMB, and notice I have other options that show up that are SMB specific. I'm just going to give it an SMB name. Now, for simplicity here, I'm going to call this the same thing as I did the shared the NFS pass, where you say demo NFS, and I'm going to click update. It does give you a warning saying that you might lose access to data. When you're adding protocols, you're not going to lose access to data. This is a generic one whenever I do an update, because we may be changing some settings that might remove access if I want to take away a protocol there. But in this case here, if I'm adding a protocol, it's not going to disrupt any data itself. So I'm going to say, yep, we want to go through and do the update. it goes through and commits that change. And we see now that we have this shared out over two different protocols. So I can come back here to my Windows client, and where before I did not have, I just had demo SMB, I now also have demo NFS. I can go in here and hey, those are the files that I had created. So I can take a look at my hello world here and oh, hey, that's the data that I wanted. I can come through, I can say, write some data out. We'll save this here. And that data, that file is then saved. I can come back to my NFS client here. I will see here that my file update time has changed. I can cat the file out, and I see that those updates are in there. So I'm able to read and write across both the protocols. Notice my group is the same. My ownership is the same because this system does know that I have an NFS ID, an NFS user ID, and it knows my Windows user ID already based on how we have the provider set up. But it's all visible there, and that's good. Now, if I go through and do something like look at permissions on this, the permissions from an SMB standpoint might look a little different than you'd expect. Because if I look at the permissions here, I'm going to see basically the representation of what the mode bits are for this. So in this case, everyone has read. I, as the owner, have read write. My primary group or PWAG's group has read access. And this matches what my NFS permissions are for this. If I want to change this, let's say I want to do chmod 444, I'm sorry, 444. For this, so I want to make this just read only for everybody. Actually, let's do 666. I tend to avoid 666, but we will make this 666 for that. So I'm basically going to go through and give everybody read-write access to this. For this, if I go back and I look at those permissions here, I'll tell the system to reread the permissions on the file. I'm going to see in here that for each one of these now, I have read-write access here. They're reflected from Windows. Now, if I want to, because this is the NFS flavor, if somebody does try to go through and add or modify permissions, we're going to go through and say, hey, I want to add another group to this. We're going to do that and say, okay, I'm going to get an error here because the NFS mode bits that the flavor that this view is using don't have that concept, can't do that. It blocks changes for them. Okay, so let's go through, let's do the same thing for the SMB one. Okay, so if I go over for the SMB flavor, for my SMB one that I created before, I'll do demo SMB. Find my view here, it's shared all over SMB. I'm going to go through and edit this. I'm going to add NFS v3 as a protocol to this. It's not going to add any other questions for this because the path is fine there. I'm going to go ahead and do an update here. And it goes through and makes that available over NFS v3. Now, if I come back to my views here, if I do a show mount -E, I'm going to see on this, through my commands here, I'm going to see here that now I have within this my demo SMB NFS export, and I can go through and mount that. I go through and mount. I have my mount command right here in my history on this. So I'm going to go through and do the mount on that. Hopefully I have my password right. Demo SMB. And I'm going to see, there's my file. Now, if you look at the permissions on this, the permissions are pretty well wide open on this for it because the permissions are governed by what is in what is in what is set over SMB. So this one here is basically allowing full control for owner, group, and other for that based on what we have. I'll show you how we can modify those there. But I can go through and I can look at this file still. I can look at it, I can edit it as I would because I've got the ability to go through and edit this. And that's a lot of it. So I can read and write as I need to. If I wanted to go through and do like a chmod on this, the chmod's 444 against this. It'll look like it succeeded, but again, it doesn't change anything because NFS is being blocked from doing this because of SMB, because of the protocol differences and the granularity we set in the view policy. But I come back here into my Windows client, and I can go through in here, and I can see that, oh, hey, I made changes to this file, because I put hi there into it on that. I can set my permissions here for this. If I want to add a new group to this or make modifications from Windows here, I can do that very, very, very easily for this. So I can go through and let's say I want to add a new group on this Unix group here. We're going to go through and add that to them. I'm going to give them read and execute, and we're going to say OK. And OK, and the permissions will be set on that file. But as expected, because NFS doesn't have any knowledge of this, we won't necessarily see any external representation of it because the granularity for NFS isn't there. So that, in a nutshell, is how we would go through and create views and how we create view policies within VAST, and how we would go through and do some basic setups of multi-protocol and a couple of very simple examples there. But it gives you kind of the idea for the general principle of things there. So with that, that concludes my webinar for the day. I don't believe I have any other slides here. Where's my slide deck? But that'll conclude our webinar for this. Kristen, do you have anything you want to talk to here?
Yeah, so I think there were some questions in the Q&A, and Phil, I'll give you a minute to look at those. In the chat right now, I'm going to share the link to the deck for our presentation today, as well as the link to register for our next webinar. So I've been putting some links in the chat for you all while Phil was talking. We are concluding our advanced customer training webinar series for admins next month. And so there is a list of all of the sessions we've done, and our next one is analytics, performance monitoring, and troubleshooting. That's going to be a really great and important one for you all to attend. There's a link to register. And so we would love to see you there. We'd love also any feedback you have as far as how it worked to use the live lab today during the presentation. If you want to pop those in the chat, or just, type a 1 out of 10 for whether it was helpful to you, that'd be great. With that, Phil, I'll hand it back over to you. I know you've had a chance to look over some of those questions, maybe some additional comments.
Yeah. So the first question there about setting permissions via a particular protocol, presume that the view allows the protocol in question. Yeah. So basically, if there is a relationship with that, partially the view policy is what determines which protocol has the ability to set permissions, and the view policy determines what the granularity of those permissions are. So again, if I'm using an SMB security flavor in my view policy for a view, I can read and write data across NFS. I can read and write data over SMB. I can read and write data over S3 with that. But ultimately, I can only set permissions, and the types of permissions I can set will be controlled by SMB and limited to what SMB has the ability to go through and set. So I wouldn't necessarily be able to set a user identity. I wouldn't be able to make use of a user identity policy with an SMB flavor view. If I wanted to use a user identity policy, I would have to have a view policy that is set to an S3 flavor, and I could access that over SMB. For that, my permissions will be governed by, regardless of the protocol, whether it would be NFS or that, by those identity policies. So if you think about it, regardless of the protocol that you're using, we ultimately maintain a single source of truth for permissions, and the security flavors determine what that single source looks like and how granular that single source is. So the next question, other question is that if you're already doing multi-protocol, do you necessarily need to do it? And the answer to that is no. We've got many customers that may just be using one protocol, and they're doing all NFS, they're doing all SMB. That's perfectly acceptable. We're happy to do that. But the nice thing is that when you add in additional protocols, it does not go through and change the underlying permissions on files or directories that are out there, you're just enabling that other protocol. And if I have access to a file over NFS, I will have access to a file over SMB or access to that same object over S3. If I don't, then I'm, regardless of whether I'm coming in from NFS, SMB, or S3, I won't have access across any one of those. We maintain that single rule, that single source of truth for permission access, so it's going to be consistent across all the protocols that we use. Adding the protocols to view, again, those are non-disruptive with that. And generally, if you're removing a protocol from a view, it's going to be non-disruptive as well. Obviously, if you are somebody's actively using that protocol at the time you take it away from a view, that will disrupt them. But that's kind of assumed. If you're not, as long as you're not making changes to the protocol that you're adding or removing, it's not going to affect it. It's not going to affect things. I think that's it. There is one question about the labs there, about lab access that I can't really answer to that. But yeah, so is there, if there's any other questions, more than happy to entertain them.
All right. And one thing I'll say too, I know you all have, if you're a VAST customer, you have a whole team that supports you and that you can contact with questions. We also wanted to make sure, Jonas was talking about the community earlier that we have, and that community site has also a forum section for help. And that's another place where you can post or view what other people have posted to just help among VAST users to be able to share information as well. So wanted to highlight that feature. Jonas just put the link in the chat. With that, I love to end class early, so we will go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much. You'll receive an email with the recording and with the deck, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.